This is Basket Case Clubs, CPR Group's podcast where we turn basket case clubs into showcase clubs. Basket Case Clubs. Hello everyone and welcome back to Basket Case Clubs. My name's Michael Connolly and I shall be your host on this journey of, now I have to say it, Steve, basket casey goodness. Joining me as usual is my brother, and for the first time ever in the same room, hence why you're going to hear all of the background noise, Steve Connolly.
Yes, hey! Oh dear. Now, yes, I'm here, but we also have a very special treat for you all today, and that is that we have one of our wonderful team members, Matt McEwan, joining us, and we're talking about organisations reaching the end of their useful life, or not, and members making the decision or not making the decision to wind up, and some of the considerations that go around that. And it's topical because of something that happened only, was it last week? With a meeting whereby members of an incorporated association, which is an association made up of clubs, decided not to wind up. But they made that decision for the second year in a row. So I'm going to hand over to Matt, who is going to share some of his thoughts on this situation, and we're going to delve a little deeply into the basket casey goodness of this topic of winding up or not.
Welcome, Matt. Nice of you to join us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Matt, Matthew, Macca.
Macca, I like Macca.
You like Macca?
I do.
Okay. All right.
But Matt's fine.
Shit, I got to start calling him Macca now. So Macca, I got to start with the first question for you. Does it make you feel worried that Steve introduced the topic of ending relationships by introducing you? So I hope you've enjoyed your time with us. But
yeah, it's been good. I thought I passed probation, but obviously not.
So tell us a little bit about this story. Obviously, we'll try and be discreet in talking about the actual organisation.
So the organisation that we're talking about, Michael, as you know, that was last year that they had their AGM, or their first AGM, with the possible intention to wind up, and you got involved with the organisation to step them through that process. There was a lot of discussion from the clubs and the affiliates, like Steve talked about, because the association is made up of clubs, and at that time they decided not to wind up, which meant that they would have to elect their office bearers and go again for another 12 months, which has now passed. So recently, after the same types of discussions, the association asked us to help out again to run the annual general meeting with special resolution to wind up the association. So we went through the same process again, and during that annual general meeting just recently, the clubs decided to not wind up and to go again. And interestingly, the vote was even stronger against it than it was 12 months ago, which was surprising to me, at least, thinking going into it that because they'd had 12 months and nothing had really changed, that it might have been more of a foregone conclusion than it was 12 months ago.
So what do you think were the catalysts for them wanting to wind up in the first place?
Wanting to wind up, as is the case with a lot of them, I think the volunteers just couldn't give any more. So the people that need to be the president, the treasurer, the secretary, and all the other committee members, most of them, if not all of them, are already involved in their own clubs as well. So it's a double up. They've got kids who participate in the sport, and having to do all that again for the current committee, they just said, no, we can't do it. So that was probably the first thing, that if we need to continue, we need to get fresh people in here, and I don't think they had anyone. Actually, I don't think, I know, because
we were there.
During the AGM, even though they voted to continue, no one actually nominated for any of the positions. So that would be the first point I'd say.
So there can be a number of reasons why an organisation is going to choose to wind up. What do you think are the good reasons, and what do you think are the bad reasons? Sorry, there's obviously a good reason for it if it's happening, but the unfortunate reasons. So the unfortunate reasons are probably the easy ones, so start there. But then what do you think are the other reasonable reasons that an organisation might wind up?
So the unfortunate ones, and we've unfortunately had to deal with another club recently, which was a club, not an association, but they had no choice to wind up because they had got to a point where they only had 3 or 4 members, which meant that they couldn't even fulfil their obligations as an incorporated association. By the time they came to us, it was past the point of, continuing it all, because they simply couldn't. So that was actually quite a sad one, because the remaining members didn't want to close it up because they wanted to keep playing the sport and keep going, but they had no choice. So the remaining one person was sort of left to do everything. And I know you didn't ask this question, but the involvement of winding up is making sure all the assets are looked after and potentially selling some things off and making sure that money goes to another club. So that's the real unfortunate one. A one in my experience in a previous role where a club had a certain person who pretty much did everything. Everything ran through that person, and the club was doing really well. They had lots of juniors. They had been really successful with grants. Unfortunately, that one person became quite unwell and was unable to continue in their capacity. And within 12 months, the club had folded, because without that one person, they didn't have the system set up. They didn't have anyone else that was sort of sharing the load. And when that person was removed, then the whole thing fell over like a pack of cards or a deck of cards.
So I'm going to put somebody kicking the bucket as one of the unfortunate reasons that an organisation might have to wind up.
Then a third one, and this is all going through my experience with clubs I've unfortunately had to help or assist through this process, was sort of in between, where it was a junior club, but the few members, so they weren't just down to one person, but it was your classic case of 3 or 4 people on the committee. They were pretty much the only people that not did anything, but they were the ones keeping the whole thing together. And, their kids had gotten older. They had given their time. Some of them were 5, 7, 10 years into it and then just had to step away. So they made the unfortunate decision to say, well, we haven't got anyone else to fill out. We can't go again. Our numbers are dwindling, and they voted to wind up at that point. And from memory, the juniors then went to another club, and that was a good thing to do, is to send them somewhere else. So they're all the bad reasons, aren't they? Can't think of any other.
I'll jump in quickly. One of the reasons that we have been involved in a number of club wind-ups is the process of merging with another entity. So we often try and delineate between amalgamations and mergers by saying amalgamation is the process through which 2 entities become one, so both entities essentially cease to exist in their own right and become one new entity. A merge then, in contrast to that, is the process through which one existing legal entity carries on, and the other or the others wind up and essentially give their assets, as you were saying, Matt, to the organisation that's going to carry on. So that decision is often a little easier, because even though the club or association in which the members and volunteers and decision makers on the committee are emotionally invested is itself, as a legal entity, winding up, they're going to continue on in another guise under another name, because there is an organisation that's going to carry on. So that's a little less emotionally difficult for volunteers in that situation to make that decision to wind up, because they're just jumping ship and going to carry on under another club's name.
And another example is a club whose grounds and golf courses, it can happen where that land is taken over, or the entity that owns the land wants it back, and it's no longer allowed to be a golf course. So that club then has no choice but to, because it's not like you can just build a new golf course down the road.
Yeah, it takes a bit of land.
You can, if you've got a lot of land, a lot of money. So we've also worked with a club where that's happened too, and the golf club wasn't able to continue because they didn't have a golf course.
It's kind of difficult to play golf if you don't have a golf
Without
course.
somewhere near the balls, yeah.
I'm happy to share the sport. So the association that we're discussing is a BMX association, and the sport of BMX is one that's recently gone through a pretty transformational change, along with other cycling disciplines here in Australia, where we had road cycling, or cycling broadly, mountain biking and BMX all amalgamate into one entity or one body, which is Oz Cycling. So then the relevance of the governing bodies at the state and then regional level where it existed across those different disciplines of cycling was certainly diminished. And in other instances, the decision was made very promptly, yeah, look, we don't need this regional governing body because there's no real good need for it. And there was a clear decision or recognition made by the volunteer decision makers who, as Matt said, come from clubs, so they're already busy, to then burden them with more work at the next level up in terms of the regional governing body. It can become too much very quickly. So those volunteers and the decision makers from the clubs in the other regions recognised that their regional association had reached the end of its useful life. And this is something that we've discussed a bit in the past on our podcast, which is sometimes organisations do reach the end of their useful life. As difficult as it can be to accept that for those who are emotionally invested, I think that what really jumped out at me the day after this meeting that we're discussing, this AGM, which was the second in a row of this association agreeing not to wind up, so to carry on, was that maybe there's an element of fear amongst the club delegates who are the ones who ultimately need to make the decision to wind up the regional association, because they maybe don't want to be the ones that made that decision. They don't want to be the ones that end the life of that association, and therefore there's a reluctance to actually pull the trigger and make the decision, even though when you guys addressed the elephant in the room kind of during that same meeting saying, okay, well, you're going to carry on and you've made a stronger decision.
Who's going to step up?
Who's going to step up? Who's going to take on the committee positions? And there were the inevitable crickets.
Yeah, so the end of that annual general meeting was us explaining that you now need to go off and not only fill the roles, but that's almost just the first basic step, that without those roles filled, you can't continue. But also explaining very clearly that it's not just that, it's actually understanding why you want to continue, and if you do want to continue, what's the reasoning for it. So that was the first step that we've handed over to them, to go and try and find some new people who haven't been involved in committees before but might be able to contribute, but whether they can or not be pretty interesting to see.
And also those people who feel strongly enough about the organisation to carry on, to step up and do the work. And certainly this is not to speak ill of those who've, by necessity, in some cases, and just probably by pure exhaustion in other cases, have decided to take a step back from those committee positions and said, we did it for another year, you all said you wanted to carry on, we're not doing it again. We're at the point where we want to go and enjoy our kids participating in the sport. We want to, go and sit on the sideline or be pulled into the canteen to do a volunteer job at our club level. We don't have the time and energy to commit to the regional association anymore.
I think on an association level as well, that it's important for, not just in this case, but other cases where the sport still continues and the clubs still continue. So there are ways to not so much replicate, but at least find how we can do this and this that we used to do as an association, that if the association does wind up, we can still have representative teams and we can still have coaching clinics and we can still have meets and we can get into jerseys and represent our region or whatever that they might be representing without having to continue as an association. And I think that's really important to dig into that reason for why aren't you keen on winding up, other than the historical and the emotion tied to it and the tradition. We've been around for decades. Still actually understanding that some of the things that we do as an association can still be achieved without the association existing.
In a different way.
Yep.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly that I think some of the inability for volunteers or people in the organisation to see the light that things can be done a different way is, well, yeah, but we've always had this association that's
This is how we've always
coordinated
done it.
these representative riders or that has hosted these championships. If that association disappears, we can't possibly keep doing those things ourselves as clubs. But of course, there are far more than just one way to skin a cat.
Steve,
Steve, you mentioned something interesting a moment ago. You mentioned, or you drew a parallel between the winding up process for an organisation that really, we're talking about palliative end-of-life care for an organisation, really, and for some groups, there's just a matter of time before somebody realises, well, do we keep them on the respirator or do we pull the plug?
Yeah.
But you drew the parallel with organisations that are amalgamating. Now, it might seem that because, as you said, that organisation is continuing to operate, that it's a little less of an emotional ride for those people. But it's not the case, because just losing the name of our organisation that's been in existence for freaking years can, to some people, be as painful as losing the organisation, like it dying altogether anyway.
Yeah, and what's funny, I think even one of the episodes of our podcast from maybe 18 months ago now, where we talk about amalgamations and mergers, and I think the title of the podcast episode is "What Colour Is Our Shirt Going to Be?" And that, funnily enough, is an issue that's come up in this exact situation where people are talking about, their emotional connection to the colour of the jerseys worn by the riders, and that plays into the reluctance to lose that emotional personality of the organisation. So yes, you're right that it is still often a difficult decision for members to make, and there often has to be sweeteners in the deal, like all the colours of the previous clubs that are amalgamating or merging being merged into one shirt, which can often look really shitty.
That's just going to be brown.
Yeah. So yeah, I think some of the takeaways then for this consideration of winding up is, and Matt, I'm interested to get your thoughts on this, but I think really importantly, it's, as we've discussed, some organisations do reach the end of their useful life. So it's important to, I think, maintain a bit of a pragmatic view, and that's difficult because we're humans and we're emotional, and we do become emotionally connected to our organisations, especially when we throw a bucket load of time and effort and sometimes blood, sweat and tears at that organisation. So it can be a tough decision to recognise that it's time to wind up and walk away and do something different. But I think it's important to, as much as possible, if your organisation is getting to the stage, particularly if that club, which was a golf club, I think, where there weren't even 7 members, so not even the number required to meet the statutory minimum number of members. If your organisation's getting to that point, recognise it, and before you get beyond that point where you can't even hold a compliant meeting to make the decision to wind up, make the tough decision if it's the right decision to make.
And with the other example of the smaller club, which still had a few committee members, but they just couldn't go on, to your point, I think they did get in just early enough so that those, because it was juniors, it was early enough that those junior teams, there was a handful left, they had enough people to still go, okay, we're going to wind up, but we're going to also make sure that these juniors have a place to go, and we're going to reach out to our neighbouring clubs to transition, and how that works, we can work with that club. A point that I was thinking about with the association winding up and the clubs continuing, and some of the reservations that those people had about whether it's a fear or just not wanting to, put the nail in the coffin, so to speak. I think really importantly is that those types of scenarios, having a strategy outside of just ticking the boxes to wind up, we have to do this, and we have to get rid of our surplus assets and tick the boxes. But I think importantly that they also need to say, well, if we were worried about our rep teams and our jerseys and what's going to happen to the kids and what sort of coaching camps might we have, is actually put that into a strategy before you wind up while people are still involved, and actually get that all sort of sorted before you do wind up. And one of the examples was...
To identify what the options actually are.
One of the presidents recently said, well, we can still get together as club affiliates or delegates or presidents. We can still create a working group and still do the things that we're talking about here. How will we do that if the association winds up? Well, there's other ways, and I think...
In exactly the same way we're doing it tonight, guys. We're just getting together on a Zoom call. We can still do that, even if there's no association.
Yeah.
And nobody needs to take minutes.
Yeah. But I think even though you're laughing, I think sometimes that can be lost, because they might not think, or they do think that without the association, we can't do that.
That's fair enough.
And that's why I think that it doesn't have to be a big strategy, but let's just write down all the things. And maybe that was missing recently, where people had it in their heads that we don't want to miss that out, and how will we do this? But there wasn't much more thought put into it, where there could be solutions and a bit of a strategy as to how to achieve that.
You know, something that's just popped into my mind is an entirely different scenario from any of those that we've discussed already, but it's you're going to chuckle, Matt, because of your cricket background, but there's a particular region in Queensland where junior cricket is really messy. Now, we recently did a review of this Junior Cricket Association's constitution, and during every opportunity for consultation during the review of this association's constitution, I asked, is this the best structure for junior cricket in this region? And the vast majority of people in the room said, well,
if we had our time over, is this how we'd set it up?
of course, the answer was no. But because people, and Matt knows better than any of us, particularly some of the Life members who have put in a shitload of time and effort to this organisation and have been involved in its governance and administration for many, many years, will turn up to those meetings and waive the constitution as soon as the mention of restructure or amalgamation or merge is raised. And I think that this is a really important question in the context of this discussion, which is what's actually best for this sport in this area. And in the case of this BMX association, this regional association that we're discussing, there's a good possibility that narrowing the focus and just, focusing on the clubs and what's best for them and providing the greatest service possible to their members might be made more likely if we reduce our focus or remove it altogether on the regional association. As long as we can achieve the same level of service delivery that our members have come to expect in terms of representative and travel opportunities to compete, because this is a sport where it's important to travel, golf less so, but in BMX it's a really important part of the sport, is that you can travel and you can have that opportunity to compete in a representative capacity. So there are certainly some important considerations, but in our enviable position of being able to be pragmatic, because it's not our association and we are not emotionally invested, although we've been working with this association for maybe a couple of decades?
Yep.
A very, very long time.
Yep.
So
20 years.
While we certainly recognise the value that it's brought over that 20 odd years plus, certainly even before we started working with them, it doesn't necessarily need to be the only structure through which those representative opportunities are provided to the members of the clubs. So I think that's a really important question to ask when faced, in your club or association, potentially with this question of winding up, merging, amalgamating, making some significant transformative change to the legal structure of your organisation, or ceasing to exist altogether. Be driven by that question of what's best for our sport in this area, and that isn't necessarily going to be carrying on, and it's also not necessarily going to be winding up.
Yeah. Or in the case of cycling around the country, having 19 different organisations having to get around to make one really simple decision, which meant that often that decision would get made the week after the event was supposed to take place.
Yeah.
And another consideration with... You talked about it, Stephen, and I'm thinking of Life members and people who have been involved in a club or an association for decades. They may have actually been there when the clubhouse was built and when the grounds were first...
used their own blood, sweat and tears to build it.
But not all the time, but a lot of the times, that club or that association came about through another change. So I know in my experience there were clubs who had been resistant to change 30 or 40 years after their forming, but they were formed out of a breakaway from another club, and that came from a change that was needed for the betterment of the club or the sport or the kids. So that's really interesting when you look at it that way. Well, the only reason you're here is because there was a big change that happened 40 years ago.
You got to be careful, because part of me wants to talk about the sunk cost bias and the fact that just because we've invested 40 years in an organisation doesn't mean that in and of itself isn't a good enough reason to keep that organisation going. But it's very hard to detach yourself, because it was that trophy cabinet that has our name on it, that honour board that has our name on it, and indeed my name on it under this organisation that you're saying we should wind up.
But you do have to, and then it's easy to say, well, let's look for efficiencies and let's look for what's best for the sport, and that means wiping out 17 of the 18 organisations that are here. But you've got to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Do you think too, because there's some clubs that I'm thinking of who have come about either through amalgamation or a change and whatever it might be, and it's only a little thing, but the honour board from the previous name of the association or name of the club, and making sure that they are up on the wall of the new clubhouse when the club either merges or amalgamates, and just acknowledging the history of not just this club but the people who did spend decades of their life building it up. Although we're not called that anymore, these were the life members and the former presidents and treasurers of the old club in its other form.
Yeah, and I think even in that episode that we discussed amalgamations and mergers, we talked about one particular example of an organisation a couple of organisations that we assisted through that process of, going from being two separate bowls clubs to become one. And yes, the issue of what their shirts were going to look like probably took precedence over all other considerations.
White.
It ended up white with a few different colours on it, yeah. But what they decided to do was to take the honour boards, digitise them, so the honour boards from both clubs, and now they've been digitised and they are on a rolling display on a couple of different TVs throughout the clubhouse. So it's a
I thought you were going to say they did like the Michael Jackson
hologram,
the morphing thing, where one becomes the other, and then we're actually all the same.
That was a missed opportunity. We should put that to them now. I'm sure they're listening to this and they'll know that we're talking about them. So, yeah, it's a really good point that we do need to acknowledge and be sensitive to the fact that people are going to be emotionally invested in these organisations. So for us, it's really easy to apply that pragmatic filter or lens, but it's not so easy for the people who've been there for a long time and put in all the time and effort.
So there's a few things that are interesting in this. A lot of the reasons, and in fact it's, to be honest, probably most of the reasons that an organisation is going to get to the end of its life and need to be considering winding up are going to be unfortunate. We've had a loss of interest in the organisation, a loss. For small regional clubs, it can be a complete shift in the demographics of a town. When we saw the GFC hit in 2008, and it got us a little bit later, and the mining boom collapsed. It was a delayed response, but that took towns down, and that meant that the organisations in those towns had no volunteers to run, and then the only thing left was for those organisations to wind up. COVID did the same thing. We had organisations who no longer had people. They had solvency concerns and they had to stop, and then they had to go through the winding up because they were, in effect, they became insolvent through environmental factors. But more often it's a shift in people's interests, it's a shift in the relevance of organisations. How many squash clubs are around now compared to the 70s? All of us are conveniently too young to remember, but the answer is...
Oh, we still work with some squash clubs.
But yeah,
fewer and fewer,
but
yes.
How many? And Steve, aren't we
Two.
having the same discussion with
Yeah.
one of those two?
Yes,
so
we are.
50% of our squash clients right now are going through an end-of-life discussion with us.
Oh, yeah.
And it's so that is the nature of the rolling trend, the rolling popularity of different sports or different activities. So that's okay. So not acknowledging that it's largely for sad reasons, it is also sometimes a chance to say, what is our relevance in the world now? Is it what it used to be, or are there other ways to do this that deal with the fact that, as Matt, you said, you've got those STP, the same three, in that case, people doing everything at the core of an organisation, and it's just not enough. There's no sustainability there, and that in itself can be a catalyst to say, well, maybe it's time to move on. Maybe it's time to find another way to achieve what we're trying to achieve with this organisation without putting the same emotional and time burden on the small number of people who are left to do it, because we're not being replaced. So if that's what our constituents are telling us, then is there another way, or is it just time to move on?
And I would hazard a guess that the majority of clubs and associations that wind up because of that one that you said, with the we can't fill committees and that part is dying, that would usually be because the membership's shrinking as well.
Yeah.
You don't get a club with 1,000 members that can't fill 3 committee. So it's one and the other as well. You know, the reason that that's happening is because, like you said, the sport or the club or the town or something might just be not thriving like it should be, and therefore there's less people participating in the sport, and less members mean less potential volunteers, which means less people to fill the committee and other roles, and then it just slowly dies off.
So I suppose that we probably should have saved an episode about winding up for when we were winding up basket case clubs, when we'd had enough of doing this lovely little podcast that we're enjoying doing, Steve, and it was time for the end, and that was probably a better time to wind up. In fact, if you are in the future, well, firstly, if you're in the future, please reach back in time and tell me what lotto numbers that I should be paying on my tickets. But you'll be able to see if there are episodes that come after this one. For us, we don't know what the future might hold. This might end up being our last episode. So it's probably time to wind up this episode. So it is unfortunate when it happens, but if it does, are you going to go down kicking and screaming with little dignity, or is it time to say, well, what dignity is left to salvage? And that in itself can be the distribution of assets. We've got stuff that is still worth distributing, so let's make the most of that, and let's see if we can have some legacy live on. And even in the discussion through the big merger of the organisations to create Old Cycling, Steve, where there was money, those were certainly considerations. How is it that we choose to distribute the surplus assets so that it can either have the greatest benefit now or create a legacy? And we were even talking about funds set up in perpetuity that then generate money that can be given out by way of grants to mean that there's actually a meaningful celebration. So this is not a memorial prize in memoriam of somebody who's passed away. It's a memorial prize in memory of a great organisation.
Of the organisation that passed away.
Well, no, it's an organisation that ran a great enough business to be able to build up a shit ton of money in a bank account, or a series of bank accounts that we were then able to put to good use, which means that the memory of that organisation lives on, and we continue to recognise the great thing that those people did running that sort of business.
I think my mind is cast back to the golf club that we were talking about earlier that had bugger all members, 3, with one of whom was doing all the work, that actually had tens of thousands of dollars that it was able to give to other clubs that carried on. So in making the decision to wind up, the necessary decision in that club's case, they did leave a lasting legacy. So in the same way that some of the BMX associations at regional and state level have been able to leave a lasting legacy for their affiliates, it's a nice way to go out with a bit of a bang. But I just in wrapping up, then, I really like the point that you made earlier, Matt, about the fact that a lot of organisations grow or are born out of some significant change or some boom in population or a breakaway because of a change in or a difference in ideology between the key players in a club. Maybe one day we'll talk about dragon boating, where there are about half of the clubs in Queensland are breakaways.
What do you call a breakaway from a breakaway from a breakaway from a breakaway?
Yeah, it's an episode in that. But I really like that pragmatic view that we need to keep up with the times, and we need to look at our relevance and recognise that the organisations that we might be looking to wind up in some cases themselves were born out of some big change. So fascinating stuff. Any final thoughts, Mr. McEwan, aka Macca?
I had a question for you too, and I know you're trying to wind this up, but
don't wind us up now, mate.
Are there any examples in your experience, not from amalgamation or merger, where that's a relatively positive outcome, but have there been any in your experience where a club or association has wound up and it has been really positive and they did it really well and everyone was on board and it was, yep, we all agree it's time and we're going to distribute our surplus assets and we're going to do some great things out of this, and from this negative or unfortunate circumstance we're going to get some real positivity out of it?
So being a Seinfeld fan, what you're asking is if at the end of a relationship people can actually still be friends like Jerry and Elaine.
Exactly.
I've got one example, which was a bowls club that Chris, one of our wonderful...
Our lovely listeners know Chris. He's been, believe it or not, on a few bowls club interviews.
But yeah, poor bugger, he always gets lumped with the problematic bowls clubs.
It's got nothing to do with your age, Chris.
So he worked with the bowls club in Brisbane. He actually, around the same time, was working with 2 bowls clubs in Brisbane, one which was a about as bad as horror stories get. Club was, significantly in debt, more than $1 million in debt, was insolvent, and the decision was very easily made to wind up.
And then the floods came.
And then the floods came. The second floods came, yeah. And this other club that was far more proactive and recognised, in keeping with the theme of our discussion today, recognised early enough that they were waning in relevance and that members were leaving, going to do other things. In some cases, sleep for a long time in a timber box underground, and they made the
because this is a podcast and there's no video for our listeners. You'll be happy to know that Macca just sat there and shook his head. Can't believe you won.
Yes. So they made the decision early enough to be able to distribute their surplus assets, but not only that, they worked with their landlord, which was council, to help find another really valuable use for their facility. So some neighbouring sporting clubs, not bowls, but clubs situated immediately next door, were able to take over their facilities immediately and make use of those to meet a growing gap in their own facility provision. So that's probably a really good news story where the bowls club itself was able to give its assets to other bowls clubs that were carrying on, and then the facility was put to good use immediately. Because often when we see clubs fall apart like that other one that was in significant debt, the facility then as a valuable community asset sits unused, and then the community misses out, which is another crappy outcome.
And thinking of bowls clubs, and we're talking about sports, waning, and whether it's just sports or that little pocket in the world, there's sports like pickleball, which you're talking about squash. There's not as many, squash courts as there were in the 70s, but there was no pickleball.
No pickleball back
10 years ago. And talking about bowls club, walking football.
Yes.
Is another one that I've been told they use some bowls grounds.
Yep.
And again, I assume that sport wasn't around 10 years ago that I know of.
I've always played walking football, just with a bunch of people running around.
Playing actual football. So yeah,
I thought you played drinking football.
Both.
So that's a good example of a positive outcome.
Yeah. It is, yeah. And Chris is working right now with another bowls club that has avoided the need to wind up by creating a really positive connection with a walking football organisation, and they're going from strength to strength.
I would like to extend a special thanks to Macca for joining us today. Thank you, Macca.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And Steve, thank you, as usual, for joining me on this journey of Basket Casey interestingness.
As always, a pleasure. And I think this has been really good to mix things up and get someone more interesting and well-informed than us.
Definitely better looking than you.
It's been fun. I've enjoyed it.
Good.
We'll get you back. If we ever run another Basket Case Clubs episode.
Is this the part where I tell you guys it's time to wind up?
Yeah.
I know you're hanging on to it, but it's for the betterment of Basket Case Clubs.
Mankind.
2 life members.
Yes.
We'll get an honour board.
2 life members walk into a bar. Special thanks, of course, to Jess again. Thank you for doing a wonderful job on our post-production to make us sound as wonderful as you possibly can. If you're not already following us on social media, make sure you find us there. You can search for CPR Group. If you want to sign up to our newsletter to get our interesting tidbits and pieces of Basket Casey goodness in there as well, you can get there from our website, cprgroup.com.au. Keep the good ideas for episodes coming in. It's always interesting to see how our listeners are contributing to what we're talking about here. And until next time, we look forward to talking about basket cases and turning them into showcases again.
Hooroo!
Bye.